In this video, we'll be going over the prototype we'll be using for our WordPress theme. Okay, so now that I have my prototype created, I want to walk through our code just a little bit so we have some familiarity with how this is structured, since we'll be using this a lot when we're creating our WordPress template. So I'm going to start by taking a look at my style sheet, the style.css, and I always start at the top of my style sheet with a color guide because I like to keep my colors consistent and kind of keep track of which ones I'm using, and it's also easy to kind of copy and paste these values as I need them when I'm building my style sheet. So I have that there first. And then next I have my normalize or my CSS reset, just like I mentioned I would in our last lesson. And then if I scroll down to our next area, I have my typography. So I mentioned that this is going to be one of the few things that I use a general type selector or the actual element to style it. And the reason for this is when you're creating content in the post editor or the page editor in WordPress, it'll generate these different level headings when you select different things in the editor. So since we can't always rely on the right class getting used, we want to make sure we style these elements itself so they look the right way and they're actually consistent as our site, since it's a content management system and we have a lot of content that's going to be added later on. So I've used these general types selectors, and I've set a type scale, which I always use. I find it keeps my type nice and consistent, so everything is a very mathematically pleasing scale in terms of height and spacing. It's following a baseline grid and all kinds of good things there. Then below this, I have my global styles. And for my global styles, I have things like I style my paragraphs, my links, which I also have that generic type selector for those, once again, because we can add those in the post editing screen, and they're probably going to not always use the same class that we want it to, so we want to make sure we have those styled. I have a main content width wrapper with a max width on it, so after that certain size, it's going to center our content on those larger screens. I have global styles for buttons. And then I have global styles for different sections of my site broken down into a header, a footer, and a sidebar. And the reason I've done these specific sections together is because in a WordPress template, we have template files for these individual sections. So I put my styles for those together in my style sheet in my global styles area. Then right below that, I have my page template, so I just have my 2-column template right sidebar. I didn't need any extra styles for my full width template because it's just full width. By default, we'll just be adding some specific structure for that in our actual template file, but it doesn't need any special CSS. Then below that, I have my specific page, so I have my front page template, and then I have my classes template. And if you scroll down, you'll notice I don't have any media queries or responsive styles. And the reason I've done this is because sometimes we have extra elements that we can't anticipate that are added, or we have extra containers and things of that nature added after we turn this into a template. So it adds in, for me, in my general experience, a lot of little nitpicky tweaking to change those responsive styles. So I like to just save that for a later point, and I have a little bit better idea of what that structure is going to be, and I can just do it all at the same time instead of coming back and having to tweak it just a little bit to get it how I want. And then in that same sweep, when I come in and do my responsive styles, I generally do my styles for my plugins, and if I've added any additional pages that I didn't plan on, then I go ahead and do those at that time as well. So now that we've taken a look at our style sheet, I just want to take a brief look at our actual pages. I'm going to do that in the browser so we can see them as we talk about our code. So I have a template style sheet here. I have my 2-column template, which is one of my more general styles. So starting at the top, I have a header element, and it just has a class of header, which might seem redundant since it's already on a header element. But if you remember in our last lesson when I talked about CSS architecture, we want to use a class for things as much as possible because we can't always anticipate what the HTML is going to be, and if it changes then we lose all our styles, or we have to rewrite our style, so we don't want to do that. Inside of my header, I have a nav element for my main navigation, and I've just given that a class of main navigation container since that's exactly what purpose it's serving. And then in my actual unordered list, I give it a class of main navigation since that's actually the navigation itself. And then I have a main content width wrapper, which is just wrapping all of my content. And then I have an individual one for my 2-column template, so the left column has a class. And then we have a sidebar that has its own separate class. So I've used those class to break in these template parts. Since we have a footer, a sidebar, and a header have their own template styles, I've just treated them that way in my prototype as well. Next, I'm going to switch over to my home page. So what I've done here, I'm going to start right under our header section with the actual main content. I have a div or a container wrapping all of my main content because the rest of this is going to be in template files. So I want to put the rest of my content together. So this will go nicely into those template files. And I've given this a class that's just named after what page it is. So we have a global hook for this page in case we need it later on. And then I've continued with that name structure I mentioned before. So if I have styles for a specific page, I call it by the page name first in the class and then whatever module it is. So since this is the hero section of my home page, I've just called it home hero section. The content inside of it I've called hero content. And then below that we have a philosophy section, so I've called that home-philosophy section, home location section for the location section, and then for our last section, this featured instructors section, I've called that home-featured instructors section as well. One other naming convention I follow that I want to talk about a little bit is for things like my buttons. You'll notice as 3 different classes. I have a class of button because my buttons on my site generally follow a different style, or the same style, excuse me. They generally have a specific width and height. They have a white color on a colored background, the same font, they're all uppercase, but it might vary depending on what page they're on and also by color. So I have these 3 different classes so I can tell that it has those global button styles, but it has a specific style because it's a homepage button. It's a little bit different based on my design. And then I also have a class that only controls the color. That way if I wanted to change the color of these buttons, I can just switch out that class. And down here in these colored instructor section, I have the same convention. So I have my featured instructor class applied to each of these sections, and then the modifier, it's a featured instructor pink, teal, and purple. Just because I find this works pretty well for me when I'm maintaining my site. I just like to be able to switch these out easily later on if I need to. So now that we've taken a basic look at our theme prototype and we're hopefully a little bit more familiar with the class structure and the code, in our next module we're going to be talking about WordPress's theme structure.